right.
It's Easter week, and we have a really special episode for you to get started on Easter week. It's really, I was totally amazed about how informed our guest was. Margaret Mary is a truly passionate Catholic woman who is frankly dissatisfied with the Roman Church, and particularly her stories about women priests, and particularly Mother Magdala, who was the first Catholic priest. Wow. Like my mind was so blown. I hardly even noticed that the time went by.
Yeah, it was. I was very surprised. And she is a very dedicated. Catholicism is her passion for her spiritual self, and her discovering her betrayal by the Roman Catholic Church was really,
and by her priest like a year and a half ago.
Yeah, I think it was even more recent than that, maybe.
Yeah,
that was powerful.
She tells all the stories that we may not like to look at, but are really powerful indictments of one of the biggest corporations in the world, the Vatican.
On that pleasant note, happy Easter, everybody.
Happy Easter. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, support our charities, the Compton Cowboys, and our sponsor, Adrenochrome Cola.
And subscribe, like us, do all that good stuff. Ring the bell. You can ring my bell.
6, hallo?
11.
Bestuur sicher wegen dem.
Yo iets niet, joh.
Two outlaws on the lam, taking the back roads through America.
You can't drink enough coffee for this show.
And now it's time for Monday Madness with the Moped Outlaws, Greg and Marc.
And here we are with another episode of Moped Outlaws. Today, our guest is Margaret Mary O'Connor, and we're so grateful to have you, Margaret Mary. Can we just call you Margaret?
That's fine, and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Oh, it's a beautiful spring day in California, but I guess in Buffalo, it's still a bit gray and cloudy. How are you doing over there?
Well, being Irish and being in March, it's a special warmth.
Special warmth.
As we near St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah.
And
why is St. Patrick? Go ahead, Greg. I'm sorry.
Well, I was wondering. Okay, go ahead. What do you have for St. Patrick's Day?
Well, I was just going to ask, can you say more about why it's so important to you and why you celebrate it so deeply, Mary? What is so powerful about St. Patrick's Day for you?
Well, I come from an Irish heritage, and unfortunately, I've never been to Ireland. But I think you can see the big shamrock in the back. It's just something I think every culture, whether you're Italian, Polish, it's special. If you take part in the traditions, and especially the month of March, obviously in connection with St. Patrick's Day, and in Buffalo, it's very. We have a parade down Delaware Avenue, and it's just wonderful.
You get pinched or kissed?
Pardon me, Greg?
You get pinched or kissed?
Probably the other way around.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
So we want to have a conversation about your book and about your petition and things of that nature. But before we go there, I want to ask you, what do you think the snakes symbolize in the St. Patrick's Day
story?
Well, way back when St. Patrick was there, of course, that's medieval times. And the snakes, like the serpents, weren't seen as the best symbols, and I'm not really into that. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to go any further and make my own observations. But of course, there's the leprechauns and the.
So it sounds like you really celebrate the playfulness of the day instead of getting into some deep rooted historical spiritual aspects of what might be represented.
Right.
Okay. So if I may, you have taken on the mantle of celebrating women as priests and bishops in Catholicism and have found historical evidence of this. You yourself were a priest and you were kicked out of the diocese. Is that correct?
Oh, no, I've never been a priest. I'm just a lay person or like a regular parishioner. But being, a lay parishioner in the church from the 50s, when I was a little girl, I was told, there never were women priests, period. So that's pretty cut and dry. And then through my life, I'm hearing there were women priests, so what is it? So I started to get into some research, biblical research explicitly, because, so many people ask me, well, gee, where is this in the Bible? And you're not going to see one word about woman priest, obviously, there. And there was a former priest, he's in London now, John Vingegaard, and he wrote a book, The Ordination of a Woman in the Catholic Church. And he did marvelous, research. And that's where I found out, if it isn't shocking enough, that, first of all, there are women priests, bishops, and deacons. That is going back into the earliest centuries of the beginning of our church, that Mary, Mother of God herself, was a woman priest. And right away, I think a lot of people might think now, wait a minute, maybe this was like some sort of an honorary title that was given to her because obviously she's Jesus's mother. And it was actually the Holy Spirit, when he anointed Jesus at his conception, Mary got that same blessing. And if you go back to Hebrews 7:26, isn't it fitting that we have such a high priest? And she is, after Jesus, she is this second high priest. And there's even writings from different saints, and they are telling us that she was a woman priest. John Vingegaard said she was a sacrificial priest, and what that meant was she was up on the altar and actually doing the consecration. And there's a funny 14th or 15th century painting, and it shows Mary in priestly vestments, and she's handing communion out to a pope. And back then they had a hat called the tiara. So he has it off at his side, and then there's like an angel at the side of this pope. And the angel was just, I don't know if he's laughing at the pope or whatever, but it was just funny, to take in the whole picture. And people are thinking, oh, now who is she? This lady is so disrespectful. I know the Catholic Church has told me there never were women priests. So when I go out picketing or other women, well, we're seen basically as some type of heretics, lunatics, you name it. But when I look back in the 50s, if someone would have ever told me that I was going to write a book, let alone be out picketing, I would have thought that, hey, they're the ones that lost it, telling me that I'd be doing something like this. But, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. What is the Catholic Church losing by, in essence, ostracizing women from being in these places of leadership, of priesthood and bishop, etc.?
Well, the biggest thing is right now, if you look at the population of the laity attending the church, the biggest number of women that are leaving the Catholic Church are the millennial women. And if they're leaving the Catholic Church, where's your next generation of children? I mean, it's one thing for me, like, I think people hear me and think, oh my God, she's making up this folly. This isn't true. But I'll tell you, when I had the John Vingegaard's book in my hand, and there's even a chapter on Mary. Mary was a woman priest. I threw the book up in the air. I was so excited, and then I gathered it up. Now, wait a minute. I'm refocusing. Did I read what I read? Did I actually see what I saw? And then I'll tell you that joy just turned to, it was this awful realization that my church had lied to me. And that's any woman, the billions of Catholics, whether we're in the United States, whether we're in Europe, anywhere, you have all been lied to. And
does that open the door to, okay, if this lie, what other lies are also being told through generations?
Well, there are actually, believe it or not, there's 5 emphatic statements, reasons that are prefaced as being biblical, why any woman shouldn't be a Catholic priest, or rather can't be a Catholic priest. And the first one is that women were not made in the image of God. And we know, if we go back to Genesis 1:27, in the divine image, God created them, female and male. God made them. But if you look back at the society at that time, it was so patristic that men just couldn't get in their mind, oh my God, how could a lady ever be made in the image of God? I mean, it was that cut and dry. And they were actually, they had Rome, believe it or not, is the first ones that actually started a civil law system. And John Vingegaard was saying that the society back then, unless you had a lot of money, women really weren't treated well. They were demeaned. And if you have theologians that are living in that same society, and, this whole atmosphere of discrimination, prejudice against women, they basically took some of that Roman law and shaped it into their church law. So back from the earliest centuries, women weren't, seen in the best of images. And then if you go into the thought of Paul, St. Paul saying that women should be quiet or they shouldn't teach. I had a woman priest on my podcast, and she clarified that. She said that was a specific letter that Paul wrote to a specific group of women. That wasn't meant to be like one statement that was relegated for the entire Catholic Church, but unfortunately things did obviously get twisted around. And then, of course, Eve, she was the instigator of the sin. Adam had nothing to do with it. But seriously, women were considered to be seen as sinners. So right from the bat, they're not going to be seen as the most stellar candidates for priesthood. And then, of course, the idea that Jesus explicitly chose only 12 male apostles to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Again, John Vingegaard's made this point. Rome back then, when Jesus was alive, was purely patristic society. And I mean, seriously, if he ever chose 12 women, he would have been run off some cliff. And then the last one was that the idea that you have to be a male in order to actually be up on the altar during the consecration, because you have to be showing that image of God. And anyway, these 5 points, they've all been proven biblically to be cultural prejudice. So I guess my question is, well, then why hasn't the hierarchy come out with a statement, well, you know, we're sorry, we got this wrong. But that isn't going to happen.
You mentioned that you've got a podcast. Can you just tell the listeners what the name of your podcast is?
Oh, yes, thank you. It's Your Radical Truth.
Got it. And it's under Margaret Mary O'Connor, Your Radical Truth.
YourRadicalTruth.com.
It should be noted that the day that we are recording this podcast happens to be International Women's Day. And so I think it's auspicious that we are speaking to you and that we are exploring this idea of the power of the feminine in our spiritual growth. What would be the benefit? What would be added to the spiritual growth of the Catholic community if women were able to be more present in the leadership?
Yes, of course, that would be something that would be completely new. And unfortunately, a lot of Catholics are afraid of that. But when you look at the setup right now, which has obviously gone on for centuries, no matter what nationality you are, in a family, one son would say, we're going through the Irish heritage. One son would be, Christopher would be a priest. Maybe Ryan would be a bishop. Maybe Sean would be a cardinal. But from generation to generation, you had men that were, you know, obviously priests. And if you're a young boy in the church, what are you seeing up on the altar? You're seeing male priest. All right, for the other half of the church, which are the women, what have we seen? We didn't know back then that Mary, Mother of God, was a priest. Mary Magdalene was a very important apostle. But there again, that wasn't sorted out until centuries later. So any woman that's sitting in the church, we have completely lost our own religious heritage. There would have been generations after generations, and they would be a role model for, you know, young ladies to be priests. It's like when you speak of leadership, there's a whole other half of the church, obviously the woman. We have no say in the leadership of our church. Weren't we baptized in the exact same way as a little baby boy was? The wording is the same. The holy oil, the christening is the same. And there again, this is a hierarchy that makes this like imaginary line. As soon as we go through our baptism, as soon as we, after receiving Eucharist and confirmation, that's as far as we can go. And yet, Jesus' own words, we were made in the divine image. If Jesus gives us that particular call, well, where are we going to go as women? I mean, in the Catholic Church. And that's why I want the listeners to know it's pretty exciting. There's an organization called Roman Catholic Woman Priest. It's not only here in the U.S., but it's across into Europe. And there was, when this first started back in 2002 on the Danube River in a boat, there was a bishop that wanted to remain anonymous. Because obviously, you know, if his name ever came out, that he was actually doing an ordination of women. So like the first year, there was an ordination of women priests. They came back the next year, those that wanted to be bishops. But then once that is done, whether there's that, we've heard the term apostolic succession, like going all the way back to the apostles. So these women now have that. So now with having women bishops here, they as well themselves can do the ordination of other women. So there's like now about, I think, 265 women And aside from that, they're called independent churches, independent Catholic churches. Years ago, these churches all belonged under Rome. But at some point, they decided there were two main points of contention. The first was they didn't believe that the Pope himself, just having one person in charge, wasn't right. And then secondly, they also believed that women should be able to be ordained. So these different independent churches broke apart from the Catholic Church. And there's actually one of the independent churches is called the Celtic Christian Church. And I love it because they get into Irish spirituality. So like when they're saying a mass, there's a lot of wording that goes back to nature. But there is a large selection out there. And now the word is slowly getting out to women that, that have received the call from Jesus and obviously can go nowhere in our church. And back in 2010, this was just unbelievable. Pope Benedict likened any woman that wanted to be become ordained as a Catholic woman priest. This was such a grave sin that it was likened to pedophilia.
That was what the Pope said? That was the Pope said, made that correlation?
Yes, Pope Benedict
made
that pronouncement.
Wow.
And if I could just skirt back to, before I forget, I thought this was just amazing. If you look over 2,000 years of church history, Mary, Mother of God, from about AD 30 up to 1927, had the title of Mary Priest. That was her name, that's how they called her rather, but the title was, she was the model for all priesthood in the Catholic Church. And the priests back then were praying for her to intercede on their behalf. It's just unbelievable. But what happened in 1927, and John Vingegaard mentioned this, the hierarchy took that title away from Mary. And I guess I was hit with the thought oh my God, who are these men that can take this title? I mean, you'd think there would be some intrepidation there, but no, they took it away from her. And then John Vingegaard mentioned, is it a coincidence? This is the same year that women all across the country and other church denominations started to want to become woman priests themselves. So I guess they thought, like, what's that? Out of mind, out of sight. Right. But it was the way it was done. There was they said a little small article in some Roman newspaper, and this Roman official is thanking this newspaper man. Isn't it well that you handled this question this way? And this is a question that the average Catholic wouldn't understand. Well, yeah, that's right, taking Mary's title away. But they're referring to Mary like some type of an object, a question. I mean, how more disrespectful? But I found that amazing because, like, in 1927, both my grandmother and my mother were alive. And of course, no one ever heard that.
What becomes possible for humanity if we allow the rise of femininity in this spiritual leadership position? What are the things that women bring to the table that would create a deeper and broader spiritual evolution for humanity?
Well, first of all, woman would be just such a wonderful role model. You as a woman would be able to relate to a woman priest. I mean, let's face it, there's certain things maybe in confession, obviously, you wouldn't be as comfortable sharing with a priest. You would bring back that wonderful religious heritage that has been missing. And so many times the word feminism, if the Catholic Church is speaking on the issue of woman priest, that word just seems to crop out of nowhere and it appears. And in association with that word, there's this idea of this power, like power struggle. And what is it when a woman is being ordained? It's pertaining to your spirituality. It has nothing at all to do with power. And then it's almost like, this is my own comments, the church uses that word because then it riles the other Catholic women that unfortunately don't understand the whole truth, this other side of the issue of woman priest. It just riles themselves up. So then, of course, they would be against woman priest. I mean, they're just there. They want to do what men do. They want to have that power. And lost in the whole equation is just the most important aspect of it, your own spirituality.
How has your own relationship with God and Jesus been impacted with this work you're doing with picketing and attempting to get this knowledge out to the world?
Well, that's a very interesting question because something highly unusual happened when I was writing this book. Well, first of all, I had 2 books, and the book that should have been my first book, I was actually into the middle of that, writing it. And then all of a sudden, no, I didn't hear voices, but I had thoughts through my mind, like woman priest, woman's ordination. Okay, that went on maybe just a few times during the day. Well, then as that week went on, it got so incessant. It was like constant. I basically had to stop writing what would have been my first book. And then I started writing this book. So that, I do think this is, in a sense, divinely inspired.
So the first book you're referring to, is that Journey of a Celiac Soul?
Yes, A Second Chance at Life.
And has that book been released, or is it still awaiting release?
Oh, no, that has been released.
Okay.
So what is a celiac soul?
Oh, okay. I have the autoimmune disease, celiac disease, and soul, S-O-U-L. There are Catholics that even after, finally, the Catholic Church used to have just a wheaten host. First of all, with this autoimmune disease, you can't ingest any wheat, rye, barley, or oats unless it's a certified field for the oats. And it basically, when you ingest that food, it's tearing away at the lining of your intestine. And I was within 5 months of being 6 feet under. I mean, finally, after 20 years, I went undiagnosed because everyone would look at me and think I was anorexic. But I'm trying to bring across this physical side, that why it's so important that we have to stay away from wheat. And this Dr. Alessio Fasano, he's a real expert in celiac disease. And he even said 0.01% of gluten still, it's too much for certain individuals with this disease. And that would be me and other individuals. So what I'm trying to say is where the term comes, journey of a celiac soul. For so many years, I was lucky. I had open-minded priests, and they would allow me to put a gluten-free food in the pyx, is what like a priest carries, if you're, I could put that up on the altar. Well, unfortunately, now about 3 years ago, this younger associate priest came into the picture, And after 5 months, one Saturday afternoon, he said, we have to go outside and talk. And I said, well, it's cold out. It was in December. Oh, no, we got to go outside. So I couldn't believe it. He basically planted himself right in line with the door. So you have all these people coming in and having to walk around us. And he's telling me he can no longer give me communion. And I said, Father, I said, who put you up to this? Did the chancellor? Because I was, picketing down there against priest sexual abuse as well. He just wouldn't tell me.
Wow.
So I had to call him, and he did call me back. And I said, look at Father, let's cut to the chase. You told me Saturday afternoon that aside from not being able to, you wouldn't give me my gluten-free communion anymore, that you didn't know me. And I said, yeah, this has been going on for 5 months. I said, let's just cut to the chase. I deserve to know why you're taking away my spiritual food. And finally, he's hemming and hawing. He says, oh, it's me. I said, what? He said, my conscience bothered me. I'm breaking canon law, that's church law, by the way, which was never initiated by Jesus. It just wasn't around when Jesus was alive. I said, all right. You're telling me you're going to leave me swinging out here in the wind, and yet you're going to go to bed, and your conscience is free. And then he says, I'm so glad you understand.
God.
Well, I had one of those older phones, on the wall.
Yeah.
I slammed it. Well, he's taken away my communion.
What's so interesting to me is you are obviously very dedicated to your Catholic spiritual practice. He's also in his mind dedicated to his Catholic spiritual practice. And here we have on our physical earth this war happening, in a sense, of you being denied your practice, which is very important to you. Like you said, it's the essence of it is leading you out dangling in the winds without any spiritual grounding that's being taken away from you.
Yeah, and one of the things, duties of the priest, specifically the Monsignor, is that the laity get their sacraments. And it wasn't like I committed some mortal sin. So it's just unbelievable. Initially, this realization that there's a history of woman priest and these lies and duped, I think is really an appropriate word, because this has gone on for centuries. And then to have my own communion in jeopardy and taken away. I don't know if you ever watched that show, The Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful show. I feel like I'm in some different dimension of time and space between these two issues, but I'll never understand the communion issue. And then I talked to my Monsignor that next weekend, and I'm talking to him and I'm saying, when I grew up in the 50s, the Monsignor was in charge, and an associate would have never done anything like that. And he said, oh, I tried, Peg. I talked to him, but he won't change his mind. I said, well, Father, this isn't helping me. I want to know, what are you going to do about this? He completely turned his back to me and walked away.
Wow. Do you think that there is a spiritual war happening in our current day and age, and that what you're experiencing is a part of that?
I just believe, unfortunately, that there are so many priests that have been taught that they're to be some type of a perfect priest, which will never fly. None of us are perfect. And I don't know if it's because they're talking to a lady, because it still goes on. The discrimination in the church, and they don't have time for it. Their conscience has been, now their conscience is free. And too bad if you can't receive communion, but I'll never. I mean, there's just such a division.
So what are you doing for yourself right now? Like come Sunday, will you partake?
Well, now that I've written that other book, I don't want to put any other local priest at jeopardy. There are one or two that would, take care of me, like my former pastor and others over the years, but I just don't want to get them in trouble.
So what do you do?
So there's that Celtic Christian church that I told you about.
Right.
They started it after the pandemic. They have a virtual communion service. So it's really nice. I go to that online, and, they have all the readings, and they give like a homily. And to me, that's more like the ministry of Jesus, because the ministry in the Catholic Church today, and again, this is hard for me to say because I love the Catholic Church, but this ministry isn't the ministry of Jesus. And something has to happen, and eventually it will, because we know the awful priest shortage has put the parishes in situations where you got about 5 or 6 parishes, and now they're starting to close them because they can't go on. And it was just despicable. They closed this one parish. They told the family, oh, yes, your children will be able to go till June. Well, then back in January, all of a sudden, they have like an emergency meeting. Oh, no, you won't go until June. Well, then the TV station got involved. And then they wrote this letter, and they said, oh, we're so sorry. It didn't mean anything. And then within 3 days, they send an email out, and they tell the parents, you better still give your money, because otherwise we will close before June. And then they had an after-school program that they just announced a few days ago is going to stop effective March 27th. And they prefaced it saying something like, well, we really thought about this, and this was a very hard decision. Luckily, the principal there has gotten other teachers together, and they will carry this on until June, because it was just putting the parents in an awful situation. They're out at work, and they're figuring, well, their children are covered, So something really has to happen, and with the awful sexual abuse issue too. Why is it that a bishop has the discretion? If a priest is raping a child, he can look at that as a sin or as a crime. And if it's a crime, obviously the priest would be arrested, booked, taken away. But all the bishops make a determination that it's a sin. And I mean, that's just abhorrent.
Does that allow the bishop and the guilty priest to then, because as I understand it in the Catholic faith, I can go to confession and my sins are healed and erased. So
Yes.
if a rape of a child is looked at as a sin, then that allows the priest to be in a confessional and have that sin healed and erased. That's the repercussion, is correct?
Yeah, and they never have really any repercussions, and even those that are sent away to facilities, they're not. They come back and they do the same thing, and then plus it's like a reward. They're exposed to a whole new community where they can prey on their victims. So I know, they keep, even with Pope Francis, what he's tried hasn't worked. But this again isn't the church, of Christ.
Do you think
And this isn't going to be cleaned up until the average everyday Catholic really gets involved. Our hierarchy, when you think of it, they've never been held accountable. And as a result, they can move on their merry way. Let me give you an illustration. Back in 1976, the Pope has what's called his own commission, the Pontifical Biblical Commission. And they said there's no biblical reason why woman can't be ordained. Well, hello, 1976, 2024. Vatican II had a council on the pastoral constitution and the church in the modern world. And under Article 29, in so many words, it was going to completely eliminate any type of discrimination in the church, whether it be like sexual, racial, cultural. If that would have only been addressed, the woman priest, this equality issue would have been taken care of. And then going back into 1974, I believe it was called the International Theological Commission, and they had a whole study looking back, were women's deacon in the Catholic Church? And we all know 2016, Pope Francis started that whole new commission looking at the same thing, and then that didn't fly, and then he opened up another commission. But whether it was John Vingegaard's, whether it was Gary Macy, The Hidden History of Women's Ordination, he basically explicitly says that women were on the altar with men to be like ordained as a deacon. So they're on the altar, they're in the presence of a bishop who officiates in prayer over them. He lays his hands on them, and then they like receive a stole to wear around their necks. And as well, they were able to drink from the cup. Women were as much ordained as men, and they were called deaconesses. And then yet, even today, we're still in this, where they're women deacons. It's for someone like me or other women, fortunately, we're just so grateful that now we know there's this actual history. It wouldn't be starting something new. It would, in a sense, be bringing back something from the past. And you talk about a shot in the arm. I mean, it would just be so refreshing. But as well, having women being priests would be a way to begin to address that awful hemorrhage, from the priest shortage of today. And I'm sure you would get, it would just enliven the Catholic Church. You could have a man, obviously, giving a homily, but then you have a woman up there doing the same thing, and you would get like a completely different perspective. Yeah. So I just think it would just be so fresh, and so it would be, I don't know if you're familiar with Vatican II. This happened back in the...
Yes, when there were the two popes. Is that what you're referring to?
There was this Pope John the 23rd, and he basically said, we need to open up the windows of the church. We need to see the signs of the times. And then he had this Vatican II council that there was one even with the laity. And it was unheard of. He invited in religious ministers from all different denominations. But unfortunately, he came down with cancer. And what he was trying to enact never came to. But the most exciting part of that was they went back into biblical research. And the everyday Mass that we have on the weekend is the closest as to how it was celebrated in the earliest centuries of the Catholic Church. But they never had, let's say, Vatican II 101. Seriously, it was never introduced appropriately to the congregation. And up to that time, the Mass was said in Latin. The priest was looking towards the altar, and you as a parishioner were seeing the back of the priest. So when these changes got turned around to celebrating that Mass as it was, that meant also they changed it from Latin into English. And unfortunately, so many Catholics think like it was always in Latin, but before it was in Latin, the language was in Greek. And then before that, it was in Aramaic. So there have been changes, obviously, through the centuries, but it came across as something so that the average Catholic was, where's my Latin Mass? And then I guess it was a shock because the priest was facing the congregation, but then it made it more personal. And then they had the priest would say something and you would, say different things back. It just made it completely personable. And I really didn't understand Latin, but in your old missals, you did have like the translation. You see Latin and then you could read the English. But that was just such a lost opportunity. And now you have Pope Francis that's going back into Vatican II. And he wants the bishops all to be together. And again, it's not that the bishop shouldn't be seen as like ruling everything. He should be working with the laity. And I believe it was in the 5th century in Chalcedon, if there was an ordination going on, this was neat. It was just your local community that chose the candidate. And if a bishop ever tried to interfere with that whole ordination would be null and void. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful today if we could go into our local parishes and pick a candidate?
To be a different parish, that's for sure.
Oh, definitely. So I don't know, to some people I know I'm
there's
over the top, but I just feel sorry that the other Catholic women don't realize this whole other side to the story of woman priest. And to me, it's like a grassroots effort to try to get the word out.
So do you see that there's potential to have a woman pope?
If women are allowed to become woman priest, yes. And there was a Pope Joan, I forget what century that was. And unfortunately, she was in some procession outside and she gave birth to her child.
That kind of destroys the whole celibacy aspect of.
Yes.
I think that can only happen.
From that time onward, really, they built some special chair so that the candidate to be was, they could tell if it really was a male or a female.
That's funny. So this Joan was pretending to be a man in order to rise up through the.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And It was working until that point.
And that's brilliant.
Margaret, is it possible that so much of this goes back to Constantine and the kind of elimination of some of the Gospels that were pre-Constantine? I mean, there were so many things that got narrowed down when the Romans took over the Christian.
Oh, definitely, because he wanted it a certain way. And there are the apocryphal books and those that aren't. And basically, if you look back through the centuries, you had the scribes, and it basically depended who the Pope was at that point, who was in charge, and how they wanted to present this material. So it was like written, and it's been rewritten over the centuries. And it's all been looked upon from the perspective of like a man obviously telling the story, writing this down. And then when you have this research from females, they actually found out that so many times when the word cleric is used, it was actually in relationship to a woman. And I wanted to also bring out a point is, how we always hear the story, Jesus obviously chose only the 12 men, and that was it for apostles. This woman, biblical researcher, Ida Ramling, she found this thing, it's called a concept of apostleship. And it means, what is an apostle? Who is an apostle? Anyone who is divinely sent out, either by the divine one himself, Jesus, or by a particular community. And then we find out through biblical research, this Junia, who's been referred to over centuries as a male apostle, was actually a woman apostle. So when you start finding like that there were woman apostles out there, and there were many more than just Mary Magdala. So this is like a whole other area that's been hidden. Just another thing you were mentioning earlier about what other lies are there. Well, I guess this would be what other omissions that unfortunately, there have been.
Doesn't this also point out that for centuries now, the divergence from the teachings as represented by the Roman Catholic narrowing of what's possible for us all to study has meant that true Catholics now can exist outside of the Roman Catholic Church, that there's something to be said for wherever two or more are gathered in my name without necessarily us having to be at the mercy of the Roman Catholic diocese.
And that's why there are so many Catholics today over these various issues that have left the Catholic Church. Their faith is still as strong as it can be with Jesus Christ, because that's obviously where the real ministry is. And if you're in a situation that, something just doesn't gel and it's completely wrong, well, then for yourself, you go where you can go and you feel that, you're really getting some spirituality. But isn't it sad that this institution has just been so blind, and now even into the awful reality of we know how they've hidden and not divulged information. They still seem to be in some type of a la-la land. And I'm not being smart, but this is there's just such division between what they're saying, that we should take care of the poor, which, yes, we should. But then what about the clergy? They get the best of food. Why don't they have more food kitchens? If it wasn't for the sisters years ago, starting back in the 60s, they started having food pantries, whatever, serving soup, whatever. They're out on the everyday trenches of life. Our church really would have, folded.
Well, hasn't Rome been responsible for atrocities for centuries? Just the Inquisition is an example. It's been errant for more than generations.
Yes, you talk about twisted thinking. And then how do you do such atrocious things? And then we're all of a sudden switching over into like a spiritual side of the church. Everything is hunky-dory. Even racial discrimination. And how, well, we've all heard the horrific stories of how Indian children, American Indians, Native Americans, they were only youngsters. And they were basically, a car would come along, the police car, and just take these children. And you probably saw that segment on 60 Minutes where the one child, I guess basically when he was in one of the classrooms, he could look down and see his house. But how they just completely took their names away, and it was awful. And then if the children died, they were just like basically thrown out in some grave.
So what is the path to redemption for future Catholics?
I think it's to learn the true history of the church. And in particular, when you do it in relationship to woman becoming Catholic priest, then you realize how they have just been completely bigots, if you will, towards women. And women's equality does not mean anything to them. It's never been on their radar. And what does that say in 2024? What does that say if you have a daughter, a mother, a sister? Shouldn't you, as a man in this church, be speaking out on these issues?
It was Mary who led.
I mean, it's like, unfortunately, whatever the issue is, you have to bring attention to it. And like how it's just taken too long for this priest sexual abuse issue. Every single day, no matter where you are in the U.S., across the world, it's coming out. More and more individuals have been attacked. So get involved, make your voice heard, and don't put up with this nonsense that, everything is hunky-dory, because it isn't. But I think they've put themselves in this position because now, as I say, like if there's 6 churches in a certain area, it'll dwindle down to 3, eventually to 1. And then by then, what is the population going to be in that church?
So
it's awful. They could turn this thing around. But it's been like, it's not an excuse, but this has been this culture of hiding all this sexual abuse. And celibacy, there's several experts, even priests, that have said that they have to get rid of the celibacy. And celibacy, again, wasn't created by Jesus. This goes back into the Middle Ages, where you had these greedy popes. And they didn't like it that if a man died, his family then could get, whatever that money was. They wanted that money for their church, period. And then they just started this celibacy bit. I mean, let's face it, how unnatural it must be for a young man. Something's wrong. I mean,
in your book, Scandal in the Shadows, tell us a little bit about what your conclusions were from that book and what had you decide to write that book.
What made me initially decide was when I finally calmed down, my Irish temper, after learning I had been deceived, was this wasn't right. What about the other millions of women here, Ireland, Philippines, anywhere in Europe, across the world? Why shouldn't they know this truth? So that was my main motivation. And then at a point when I got in the book, all of a sudden I had great intrepidation, because it came to me, oh my God, I'm going against like a conglomerate, and there's just little me and the Catholic Church. But then I realized I had the truth behind me, and I knew I had to be telling the truth, because obviously, this would be checked on. But in a sense, it's given me the courage to talk, because I know what I'm saying is the truth. And I'm trying to just share that with other Catholics and let them see, even after going through the experience of the lies and the deceit, there actually is hope if we get our laity together, so that the church, for once, the hierarchy will be held accountable. And then that's when there will be changes.
So if you're interested in learning more about her books, you can go to yourradicaltruth.com. There's lots of information there about these books. You can also help by petitioning on her behalf to have some of these aspects restored. She's currently running a petition on her website to ask Pope Francis to reinstate Mary's title of Mary Priest. It's really amazing. The more we talk about this, the more difficult it gets to feel in my chest. The realization of the falsehoods and the misdirection and what that's costing us all spiritually, and the penance that will have to be paid as a result. It's so monumental. As we get close to wrapping up this conversation, normally we ask a question about music, but I think this is an episode where
we got to ask the question. No, we got to ask the question.
Okay.
So we can ask a different question if you have one, but that's got to be the question we end with.
Okay. Is there anything you want to add, Margaret, before we ask our last question in this conversation?
Yes, I'd also like the listeners to know, under Vatican II, under the laity, there was an article, and it explicitly says that the laity, now, of course, this was written back in the 60s, but I'm taking the laity this time to include women as well, that you have the right to speak out on issues of importance that affect you in the church. And what issue is of more importance, that Mary, Mother of God, you were never told she was a woman priest. She was actually a woman bishop. Why are you still treated as being not equal today in the church? Why isn't the church letting you know that the 5 biblical points aren't biblical? You have every right to become a woman priest. You are not doing anything wrong. How is answering Jesus's call to you? How is that a sin? In the Catholic Church hierarchy, in their twisted minds, it's a sin. But to me, it's between the individual woman and Jesus, just as it is between any man that receives the call as well.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. This has been enlightening, to say the least.
Yeah, we've learned a lot, I'm sure. I'm going to go back and listen to this again and pick up some of the details and break out my Google. Greg, would you do the honor of asking the final question for us?
But before I ask our final question, I do have a question. I hope it's quick. You have a lot of pictures of you with the Lady of Victory National Shrine in Basilia, which is
yes, that's where I had my pictures taken, like for the website. And that's Our Lady of Victory Basilica, and it's in Lackawanna, New York, it's only about 5 minutes from South Buffalo. And the history behind that is there was a priest, Father Nelson Baker, that started building a basilica. He went over to Rome And he was actually over in Paris at Our Lady of Victory over there. And that's where he prayed to Mary. And then he got the idea and came back here. And he actually wrote at nighttime letters to train conductors and asking them were there like women of means there that might want to donate. And then he got the money and he started like this little newspaper. There were millions of people that he fed during the Depression. He had a baby's home. And then as well, he had, they called it the Father Baker home, if due to, obviously, like during the Depression, people couldn't take care of children. They could leave the child there. He had a farm, so he taught boys like farming. They got into printing. They got into like, what's the other, like blacksmith or, just trades so that when they actually came out of there, they could, and he was so personable that he would stand out. And my grandmother had her eyes blessed by him. She was having a major eye problem, went right away. So right now we're in the process, well, they are, of trying to make him a saint. And it's just like you see that one picture up there at the dome. It's just a beautiful facility. You have to stand in there.
Okay. All right. So here, our final question we end all our podcasts with has to really do with pop culture in music. And this may have no relevance for you at all, and you might surprise us. So here's our question. Eminem or Foo Fighters?
I'm sorry, Eminem or who?
Foo Fighters.
No, I don't follow them. I know they're big. Eminem is big, but I just don't follow them.
Yeah. All right. So either one is what you're saying.
Well, Gloria Gaynor. I like her song, I Will Survive.
All right.
That's a perfect song that I can use.
Thank you so much for taking the time and energy to be with us today, Margaret. Really appreciate your perspective.
It's been a pleasure.
And an enlightening conversation to boot.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I hope the listeners will, move on this. Get off their good intentions. So thank you.
Recording stopped.